I'm Kurt Mundies for RGG EDU, and now we're going to work on some Brussels sprouts. So Rob has given me 2 captures of Brussels sprouts with a little bit of different lighting. And in his notes, he tells me that 173 is the exposure he likes for the Brussels sprouts. And he particularly likes the fill light inside of the skillet. And 175, he has more dramatic lighting on the set. So we're going to blend these 2 exposures to have the nice fill and light in the Brussels sprouts. So I'm going to select both of my exposures and process them out, and they'll open automatically in Photoshop. So 173 is kind of my hero image of the skillet and the exposure for the Brussels sprouts, and 175 is the exposure that we like the background light, and it's just there's a little less highlight punch going on. So I'm going to drag this exposure into the other one, holding down my shift key so they line up based on the outside dimensions of the image. It's nice because then I can change my opacity and the 2 plates line up perfectly. So to start blending these, I'm just going to do this with a mask and my paintbrush to kind of paint on the parts that I want to use from my second exposure. So the second exposure here, the second layer, is for the inside of the skillet. There's more fill light going on in the Brussels sprouts and some nice highlights along the back edge of the skillet. So just kind of remembering where I like that, I'm going to paint in white to reveal that exposure in those local areas. So I'm not just painting with 100% brush, which would just put it in one fell swoop. Instead, I'm painting with a lower opacity brush, which allows me just to kind of slowly build up the exposure to get it where I like it, where it's just right, particularly paying attention to the back edge of the skillet. And anywhere where the Brussels sprouts may start to get just a little too bright in the highlight, I'm going to come back and just mask that off just a little bit, just to tone those down ever so slightly, going back to the exposure with less fill light. And I'm doing that particularly because Rob mentioned in his notes for me that this fill light might be just a little bright. So I know that he was questioning that. So I'm questioning that as well, and I'm just going to address that by bringing just a little bit more tone into those really specular highlights. And so now that I have my base level composite done for the 2 exposures, and I can look at any other areas in the image that I might want to bring in. I kind of like some of the highlight going on this table surface over here from our brighter exposure, so I'm going to mask some of that in as well. Just to bring a little emphasis, that gives the image a little direction of light, I think, bringing in just a little highlight there, maybe along that plate. Next step is in all images is a little cleanup. So I'm going to get a blank layer. Nice to name this cleanup so that you remember what's going on that layer. I say it's nice to do, you know, that's a good habit to get into, but it's one that I don't necessarily follow all the time, particularly when I have a bunch of images that I'm trying to get through and I just kind of create the layers, and it's pretty easy to figure out what layer does what by turning it off and on later. But particularly if you're new to working with a bunch of layers and it's easy to get confused about what layer does what. And so my best advice for you is to label them, give them a name, and that'll help you keep what layer is doing what straight in your brain. Anything that catches the highlight that shouldn't, just cloning that out a little bit. As I'm cloning, I'm kind of skipping over the in-focus Brussels sprouts for the moment. Sometimes I like to do all the cleanup for the background or the secondary areas. So I'm sure I got all that done, and then move on to the hero portion of the image. Ultimately, I just want to be sure that I look at and evaluate every square inch of real estate in the picture for anything that needs to come out or be simplified. Sometimes I approach it like a grid in a really complicated image, start in the top left corner and work down and then up and work down and then up. And sometimes there's little things that catch your eye, but you don't want to get rid of them completely, like these little highlights on the back of this little Brussels sprout. Something about the shape of them really caught my eye. So I want to tone it down, but I don't want to remove them completely because it's nice and natural that they have a little sparkle and highlight. So in cases like that, I'm just cloning them out, maybe 20%, maybe 30%, just taking them out somewhat. Okay, so my cleanup is done. I just want to do a little bit of curves work to maybe look at adding just a hit of contrast. Particularly, I want to find a way to get the back edge of the skillet to separate from the dark counter surface. So I want to be sure that I see that step from skillet to background surface. And just adding a little contrast and brightening that up, I think that looks nice for this area. It's a little too much for our Brussels sprouts because our Brussels sprouts, we composited in another exposure there that was itself brighter. So I'm going to flip this mask to black, Command-I. And now just remembering the areas where I liked it, I'm going to build up the curves exposure there by painting white. And might put in some of that on the Brussels sprouts. Okay, I liked what that curves did for me. So now I'm just going to experiment with another curves to kind of see where do I like it darker in some areas? Do I like it lighter in some areas? I like to use curves just to kind of explore what is possible in my image. I'm looking at this highlight on the front of the skillet. I'd like for that to feel that highlight fade into the shadows a little bit more. It seems a little dark and heavy up there. So I'm going to make a curves layer that's really brightening. And I'm going to flip that mask to black again. So that curves is making a pretty strong move, but I'm only going to mask it in a little bit at a time. So the resulting effect will be pretty subtle. And I can shift click on that mask to remind myself of what it does in other areas of the image. And I'm still feeling like the back edge of this skillet is blending into the surface a little bit. So I'm just going to use this same layer that's brightening just to kind of dodge out some of these highlights inside of the skillet and along the skillet's back edge, just to help give a little definition to the skillet. So working with these curves layers where I flip the mask to black, it's always a bit of painting it on and painting it off and painting it on. So my finger often just rests on the X key, which is the keyboard shortcut for toggling between your foreground and background color. And I'm not thinking too much about, am I painting white or am I painting black? It's kind of like, yep, that's the direction I want to go. No, that's not the direction I want to go, so I hit X to go the other way. So still working with this highlight, just pop that out a little bit more. And I also think that this handle needs a little more definition from the background. So I'm just going to dodge any of these highlights. Again, I'm using this curves layer as my dodge. It's brightening. So I'm going to hold down my Option key and click the visibility of my background layer so I can just see the progress that we've made with this image. And I like what's going on in the skillet. You know, I like that these highlights are popping a little bit more. This little corner of this back handle is really kind of competing for attention against my Brussels sprouts. So I think I'm going to go in and just clone that out just a little bit, just to put a little bit more black tone into there, just to darken that highlight down a little bit. To make it a little more subtle, just so it doesn't scream out, catch my eye. And now that that's gone, that doesn't catch my eye anymore. Now for these little shapes inside the Brussels sprouts are starting to catch my eye a little bit. So I'm going to do the same thing there. Just clone them out ever so little, just to make them a little bit darker. Because I really like these shapes of the tops of the Brussels sprouts. And some of the other things inside of there, just the little corners of leaves, start to be a little busy. So anything that kind of catches my eye that's not where I want it to be, I'm just going to tone it down ever so slightly. Okay. I think we're starting to be in a good place with this image. This highlight catches my eye a little bit here too. Okay. We'll tone that one down also. Yeah, that's nice. Might just look at adding a little bit of a vignette. This bottom part of the image is very dark, you know, so I don't need a whole lot down here, but something about this area is still kind of spilling the light, and I want to keep it here. So just ever so slightly, I'm going to burn that down a little bit. Again, flipping it to black. flipping it to black, and then just to mask on into this corner. It's kind of a one corner vignette a little bit. Two corners. So check my progress here again, and I think that this is opened up. I've got a nice combination of background exposures and light going on inside of the cast iron skillet. So I think I'm at a place where I'm ready to save this and move on to our next picture. So looking at my before and after and see what else I see that needs to happen. I think that this curves that I've brightened up here is really popping this highlight back in the back. So I'm going to start with masking that off a little bit up there. Just a little bit. That is a white highlight, so don't necessarily want to make it like muddy. And maybe pull in some more tone from my vignette layer. Now that my eyes kind of caught up in that, can't look away. Sometimes I think one thing and wind up doing another thing. So I am going to pull down the highlight just a little bit so it's just not pure white. One thing that might help up here also is how this highlight is on the bottom of a glass and then it kind of fades off to the edge of the frame. Might help to come in here and just remove some of that highlight that's going close to the edge. Just to kind of simplify that shape a little bit. I have my curves where I've pulled down that highlight there and I have it masked in. It's nice I can come back and revisit where I put the points on that curve if I just want to fine tune that a little bit. So before and after, see that the light is really pulling to down here. We still have some bright reflections up there, but I think what we did toning that down off the edge really helps simplify that. I think we're at a place now where I feel good about where we are. We'll save it and move on to our next picture.